Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Tech Backstage. Fairly busy this week, actually. I think we're doing shows almost every day this week, but I'm excited to be joined by Laurel Farrer from GitLab, Principal Strategy and Operations over at GitLab. How you doing, Laurel?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. Like I was telling you backstage, I'm excited because GitLab's one of those companies that I think a lot of people know, but it's even one of those technologies that we use personally. So I'm excited to have you on the show, and I'm excited to just kind of talk all things workplace flexibility and distributed teams, and just excited to talk about what you guys do at GitLab, or what you all do, so that we're PC, right? So, but
Yeah.
before we do that, I'd love to just talk a little bit about you and your background, and how you ended up at a company like GitLab.
Great. Well, I'm a remote work expert, which was not much of a job title a few years ago, but now it is. So I've been building distributed and hybrid teams for about 15 years now. So
Wow.
yes, before it was a thing, before it was cool. So I've been doing that primarily as a chief operations officer or COO. So I did that for many different organizations in different industries of different sizes, and eventually owned and founded the world's leading consulting firm specializing exclusively in remote work. And that company is called Distribute Consulting. It's still operating, running smoothly. But just recently this year, I moved over to GitLab. So again, as a remote work expert, there was some work to be done in terms of scaling the knowledge of GitLab. They're very, very iconic in the world of remote work and being the world's largest distributed company. And so we really want to make sure that this information about how to do this effectively is as scalable and accessible as possible for all of the companies out there that need it.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Especially, I'm a huge fan of remote work. We're a fully distributed team, and I think I always love the idea of remote work, but especially because when I moved to Mexico full time, it was one of those things. I was like, well, I'd like to work for a U.S. company, but kind of struggled with the idea early on because, like you said, it's kind of really become mainstream over the last couple of years, especially
Right.
with, as we all know, the pandemic.
Mhm.
But I'd love to understand a little bit about how you chose to go into consulting on remote workplaces 15 years ago. Did you just fall into that, or was that like something you're like, I really would like to, I'm passionate about remote work? Like, how did you get into this line of work?
Great question. It was definitely an evolution, because now it is mainstream and now it's socially accepted, but it's still controversial, even with
Yeah.
100% of the world at least having exposure to working from home. So it was much, much, much more controversial then. So, yes, back 15 years ago, I was accidentally an office manager, an operations manager for a hybrid team. So my role was intentional, but the hybridity of the team was accidental. There was a workplace shift from one office space to another, and some people ended up working from home during the interim. And and I was managing that process. And so when I went to my next role, we were in a phase of growth and startup that we were trying to scale, trying not to, get a loan and get funding, but trying to stay lean. And because I had just had that experience with the hybrid team, I said, "Oh, I have an idea. What if we didn't get an office just for a quarter or two? What if we worked from home?" Because I had seen how much it saved on real estate costs for my previous company. And I said, "I know that this will keep us in the black. What if we just did this for a quarter or two?" And then the spoiler alert is that we never went back. We stayed distributed. And by nature, that raises questions and gets you some attention from other companies looking to cut costs. So that was the development and evolution of my career. And just after a decade of answering questions for companies and consulting them independently, that's when I opened a consulting firm dedicated exclusively to that topic.
And this was back in, like, I'm going to take a stab at this, like 2007, 2008.
Yep,
Wow.
yeah, 2008, that was when I started independently consulting, and then it was about 2018, 2017, 2018 that we started scaling the team and adding other consultants and officially became a firm as opposed to just an independent consultant.
And I'm so curious because of just how far back that is, but like what did that even look like without tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams? Like was that just like a bunch of conference calls or like a lot of
Yeah.
group?
It's so funny when we think about what a foreign world that was because, yeah, we didn't have Slack, but even beyond that, we didn't have cloud documents yet. We didn't
Yeah.
have smartphones yet. I mean, it was such a big deal when we all got a BlackBerry that we were like,
Oh yeah.
"What? We can email each other from wherever we are? Like this is crazy."
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the technology has definitely impacted the employee experience of being a work from anywhere professional, of course. But yeah, back then it was really staying aligned with information. So
Yeah.
yes, we would call each other, conference calls, about every day, every other day, and then once a week get together in person, maybe at a coffee shop or a temporary work site or something like that, and just sync it together in a meeting for a couple of hours and then separate again. So it was much, much, much more delineation between asynchronous work and synchronous work. And because those lines are so much more blurry now, I think people feel a lot more overloaded and overwhelmed in terms of their individual work streams. But the more that we can like polarize those again, the cleaner it feels.
Yeah. I think back in 2007 or 2000, I think I had a flip phone until 2009, maybe
Yeah.
2010. So I'm just trying to understand how it even get anything done just like with the numeric pad and trying to anyways. Um this is an excellent kind of like segue into talking about the way you guys look at it at GitLab, because I think one of the things, at least from my experience, when you're talking about running a successful distributed team, whether it was 15 years ago or whether it's today, I think you kind of have, or you have the same, you're still looking to have the same outcome, right? You're
Mhm.
looking to run teams that are able to, get through their workload, that are able to impact the company and manage their responsibilities from not in an office. And so it's different environments, different technologies, but at the end it's the same outcome, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sharing that information is the critical component of any hybrid or fully distributed team, period. And so this is where we actually can learn a lot from history and say, well, what did we do to stay aligned way back then before we had so many channels in order to share time and location? Now we've got Zoom calls, we've got conference calls, we've got Slack, Microsoft Teams, et cetera. Like we can recreate the feeling of being together in an office pretty well virtually
Yeah.
now. And so we tend to try to do that. That feels very instinctual. If we are moving out of an office, our default is to say, well, how can we recreate that same experience just using digital tools? So we try to recreate that alignment through sharing time and location, which means that we tend to have a lot of meetings and a lot of a lot of shared time together,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is why Zoom fatigue is
Yeah.
a term, right?
Yeah.
And so what we need to do is actually go all the way back to the beginning and say, well, how did this even become a possibility in the first place? And how that came to be in the era of telecommuting was, if we just share information effectively, it actually doesn't matter where we are because we are aligned as a team. We are sharing goals and results instead of sharing time and location.
Right.
So if we can go back to that and learn from history and say, you know what, we need to stop trying to share time and location and instead share information much, much more effectively, that's where our success will come from, whether we are a co-located team, a hybrid team, or a distributed team.
Yeah. And that's like, just to kind of like take that's kind of where the ways of working that you're responsible for come from,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's what I do at GitLab. I'm principal strategy and operations for the workplace team at GitLab. And ironically, the workplace department looks very differently in a fully distributed team because we don't have any buildings. So we're not we're not responsible for real estate or interior design or HIPAA. Like, we're responsible for how do our people stay aligned? How do we stay connected in our outputs and our behaviors? So we're much more focused on organizational development and organizational behavior than real estate. So the way that we do that at GitLab is through a program called Team Ops. And Team Ops is the way that we standardize expectations around ways of working in a fully distributed team. Because traditionally, in a co-located environment, you can walk around an office and observe what expectations are. You can observe cultural norms, right? You can see that people are very punctual to a meeting, or they're kind of like 5-10 minutes late kind of people. Or you can see that people are supposed to take 30-minute lunches, but they end up taking like 45 or an
Right.
hour. Like, you can see what's normal and what's expected, and what the way is of the company. But in a distributed company, you can't do that as easily. And so
Right.
what happens over time is those imbalances in employee experience, especially in hybrid teams, when some employees can see what the cultural expectations are and others can't, or others have more accessibility to conversations and meetings, and others don't, is it creates obviously imbalanced culture, but that can also snowball into discrimination and even legal lawsuits. So we try to standardize things as much as possible through learning and development resources, through documentation, and ultimately building a very, very strong infrastructure of information and knowledge management.
And this might be kind of a weird question, but to your point about, when you're in an actual office setting, you can kind of see and feel the workplace culture. You can sort of see and feel like what's going on around you, right? And one of the
Yeah.
things that I've always thought of, and this might just be kind of like you know the way that I think, but when I always think about putting together a fully distributed team, there's kind of like this idea. It's off in the future still, but it's like there's this idea that one day we're going to get to this point where maybe it's not perfect, but the remote cultures and like the remote work environment, something that you can actually, it's not something necessarily that you can touch or that's tangible, but it has this sort of feeling of permanence to it, and it feels very similar to the way that you would have the company with physical locations, right? And that might just me be like being idealistic, but I'd love to hear a little bit about, you talk a lot about processes and documentation at GitLab, but what's it feel like to be part of the GitLab remote distributed work culture?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, that's not a pipe dream. That's
Yeah.
actually the goal that so many companies are missing, that they're not doing, that is causing the problems that of productivity measurement and just employee experience alignment that people are struggling with right now. It's because they're not willing to take those moments and those opportunities to say, well, what is this? Let's just stop observing it and having this intangible theoretical culture and saying, no, what is our culture? We're going to define it, we're going to own it, we're going to document it so that it's replicable, so that it can be standardized and implemented across the board regardless of your location.
Yeah.
So that's a really important point, is to say, what is our culture?
Yeah.
Let's define it and let's document it. And this is one of the things that GitLab is so famous for, is that we have a very extensive digital handbook in which we document everything. Because like I said before, information is what keeps distributed teams aligned.
Yeah.
So the more information that you share and the more effectively that you share it, the more aligned your team will be. So we
Yeah.
write down every single cultural expectation about how to communicate, how to create calendar invitations, what language to use and what language not to use, how to make a meeting agenda and what to do in that agenda, so that no matter where you are in the company, which department you're working in, or what level of tenure you're at, it's going to be a similar employee experience in terms of virtual employee experience.
Yeah.
So many people make the mistake of assuming that remote work by itself is a culture. Like, oh, we have a great culture, we
Right.
work remotely.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is 100% incorrect.
Yeah.
Just like physical companies have completely different office cultures, distributed companies have completely different virtual cultures. So
Yeah.
you cannot assume that somebody's going to come into your company and just be able to work in the same ways that you already do because they've worked remotely before. That's not
Yeah.
how it works.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the other things that I would even add on to what you just said is that not only is it 100% incorrect, I think remote culture is harder to nail down than
Yeah.
in office culture because as soon as we get off this call, I'm back into my office by myself.
Hmm.
And it's really easy for you to feel isolated and alone. And if people don't understand the expectations as far as participation and communication and what, not even output or performance, but just how do you integrate and be part of the team overall. Remote culture for me, it's something that you have to do intentionally. It's not
Yes.
something that happens on accident. And I think I heard somebody say, I can't remember where I heard this, but I'll never forget this. Somebody told me that your company has a culture, whether you like it or not, and whether it's what you want the culture to be or not, your company has one. So you might say your company has this, oh, cool, we're remote work and all this stuff, but your actual company culture might be, toxic, private groups where people are talking about other people behind their backs. Like you're talking about discrimination,
Hmm.
potentially things that go against, labor laws and stuff like that. So whether or not your actual culture and your stated culture align, that's I think that's where in remote work it's a lot harder to do. You have to be intentional about it.
Exactly, exactly. And I think we come from this era where those value posters were hanging on the wall of the conference room,
Right.
right? That
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
like integrity.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we all had those office buildings. And so you just kind of hoped, I guess through osmosis or something, that those
Right.
values would then integrate into the vibe of the office. That was hopeful at best, right? And
Yeah.
intangible completely. So what we do, again, like you were saying, in distributed companies and teams, is we have to be very, very intentional. And we recognize that because we're not sharing time and location, a vibe is not going to organically happen through the
Right.
spontaneous interactions and of social interactions. So we have to be very, very intentional about making sure that those values and guidelines and principles are very action oriented and very visible and very experiential in the touch points that we do have,
Hmm.
which are in our information sharing, right?
Right.
So we need to make sure that the emails that we send, the Slack messages that we send, the Zoom calls that we have, all of those are somehow activating the values that we have assigned to define our cultures. And we
Hmm.
need to take them a lot more seriously. And like you said, be much, much more intentional about designing ways that they will be activated and implemented in a daily virtual employee experience.
And I guess that would be kind of the key to the actual scale part of this discussion, which is how do you it's I don't want to say it's easy to put these processes in place, right? But for example, you're talking about having a company handbook where all of the information is accessible. One of our learnings over the last couple of years is, for example, you can't just put all of your guides in Google Docs and expect people to go find them, because Google Docs is like the dumpster of where you put things that you don't want to find anymore. I
Right.
can't even find things that I worked on yesterday. And so, but for example, let's say you put that company handbook together.
Hmm.
Well, you guys got 2,000 employees now. How do you make sure that everybody conforms to that? And 2,000 employees within 10 years. So
Yeah.
how do you make sure that 2,000 people are not just reading, but digesting the material and actually implementing it the way that you guys hope for them to implement it?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what my role is. So within the workplace, my particular specialty is what's called Team Ops. And Team Ops is that program that helps define what the GitLab way is. And that includes our values, it includes our principles that we're working towards, it includes a cycle of behaviors that we need to rely on in our infrastructures that helps maintain our source of truth. So the cycle is all about how do we build and maintain and leverage an information knowledge management system in order to stay aligned. And then that model trickles down into ways of working. So what does that look like on a daily basis and how can you participate in it?
Mhm.
So it's the theory is that we're taking the very large and very comprehensive handbook and distilling it down into, well, what do you need to know in order to put that into action?
Mhm.
And that helps standardize it and make it a lot more digestible for a lot of people. But then we also integrate it into a lot of our work streams and employee experiences. So it's deeply integrated into learning and development. It's being integrated into onboarding. We refer to it often. We host Ask Me Anything sessions so that we want people to understand this is something that you can talk about, you can ask questions, and it is a tangible thing. It's relatively new, Team Ops as a concept. Obviously, the culture of the GitLab way has existed since the inception of the company. So this is new, we're growing, we're evolving, and we're having a lot of fun seeing success and seeing gaps along the way and figuring out how to solve those problems.
Yeah, I love the team ops. We call it people operations. We'll
Mhm.
probably get to the team ops as well. We didn't think human resources was a good way to call it because people aren't resources. So
Right.
we're like that's not the way to go. But I'm curious to understand, how do you guys measure success from a scalability standpoint, right? So you, in team ops, you guys are talking about, making sure that these things get implemented, making sure that people, understand how the culture at GitLab works. And, you talked a little bit about the Ask Me Anything sessions, and then also, even down to like, hey, how to set a meeting agenda and stuff, right? But
Mhm.
how do you guys measure success at scale?
That's a great question. We're actually in the process of building a calculator right now
Okay.
that we're going to start testing internally within the quarter, and then we can roll it out externally as well for other teams to start using eventually. But we have a few different layers of employee experience or ways of working that we are measuring. So the first is that we're talking about what are the principles that you're working towards? So what are those values and what are the differences of a human-based team or a people-based team as opposed to an office-based team? So then that gets dissected deeper into tenets. And those tenets are things that are unusual, or these are starting to evolve into the territory of a behavior, but something, a principle, it's smaller than a principle, but larger than a behavior. So it's something that we need to know about and need to understand that this is a way of working. Then it gets broken down into behaviors. So what does this look like in action? And that's where it starts to become measurable. So we can then do a swath throughout the organization and say, are these behaviors actually being implemented? And then even beyond that, we can go a layer deeper and start looking at metrics in action in the tools. So for each behavior, we can say, well, maybe the behavior is, using meeting agendas for every single meeting. And then within the tools, we can blend the behavior and the digital tool and let those complement each other and say, well, what are actually the metrics of usage in Google Docs with this particular title and things like that. So it starts very big and saying, are we aligned and working towards the same vision? And then we get smaller and smaller and smaller from there. So do we have a source of truth? Are we all using it in the same way? Is our traffic consistent throughout all of the departments, et cetera, et cetera?
And I'm just curious too, as far as measurement and metrics, when you guys on the team ops are looking at this stuff and you're working on building this calculator, uh, and I hate to like I'm just gonna like kind of like warn you that like maybe this isn't the right way to ask the question, but because I think one thing that, especially in modern work culture, whether it's remote or not, I think one of the things that we're all shifting towards is it doesn't, for example, like working 8-hour days, right? Like, okay, cool, you work 8-hour days, but you're only productive for 4 hours.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So now I think there's a lot more emphasis on, are you hitting, are you hitting your goals as part of the company, right? If you have a
Hmm.
task, did you get it done on time? Did it did it did you hit the expectation? You know what I mean? Things like that.
Yeah.
And that's a really broad way of putting it. I'd like to give more concrete examples, but I want to make sure we don't run out of time. But do you in the team ops department like try and relate that to productivity or making sure that people are hitting, quarterly targets or things like that? Or what's the relationship between the actual workplace culture and how you guys look at it versus what people are actually trying to get accomplished on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a big goal of team ops in general is that for so long people have been measuring the wrong things, right?
Yeah.
That they're saying, "Oh, we're sharing information," or "We're measuring results," and it's like, but are you sharing the right information and are you measuring the right results? And so that is one of the biggest problems that we are aiming to solve with this program is to say, how can we do this more accurately? How can we prioritize the correct information sharing, the relevant a way that will the most effectively increase productivity, efficiency, and employee retention.
Yeah.
So that's the primary goal, and we do that not only through formulas and algorithms and building software and tools, but more successfully, we are in constant communication with our teams and conducting internal focus groups as we are developing team ops. And we're saying, okay, this is what we're seeing. Does that match what you're seeing? Is that relevant? Does that accurately reflect not only our perception of the GitLab way, but what you actually experience as the GitLab way?
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think like you were saying, it's such a hard thing because there's been such a shift, and especially since you guys are a publicly traded company, I have to imagine that this is something that gets heavily scrutinized. But like it's really hard to take the output, for example, of one individual, and it's like, okay, cool, you got 25 tasks that you need to finish this week, and you got 23 of them done. I think by most measures, most companies, at least ours, would consider that to be a success.
Mhm.
We try to stretch ourselves to the point where it's like, well, if you can get 100% of the stuff that we ask you to do done, we're
Mhm.
probably not challenging you enough. But if you only get 50% done, we're probably being too hard on you. So we kind of shoot for somewhere in like that 70 to 80% range. But what does
But
that
diving deeper, yeah, like
yeah,
diving deeper into those, well, what were the 23 that you did accomplish and what were
yeah,
the 2 that were left over? If
yeah,
we have 23 difficult tasks and 2 easy tasks, then it's not that big of a deal. And that's a great week. But
yeah,
if you have 23 easy tasks and 2 difficult tasks, are you adequately contributing value to the team? That's a
100%.
completely different metric. So, yeah, that's exactly where that measurement clarity, which is one of the principles of team ops, comes into play.
And how do you guys we only got a couple minutes here. I might go over, Carlos, I'm sorry. But I have lots of questions. But how do you guys align on that? Do you align with, especially as a publicly traded company, do you align with other stakeholders and department heads to kind of understand, hey, this is the vision of GitLab and this is kind of what we expect, for example, engineering to contribute to this, or
Mhm.
what the product team's supposed to contribute, and then how does team ops support all that? How do you guys align all the visions?
Yeah, you would have thought that we scripted this because it's so perfect for what team ops actually is. So the second principle of team ops is actually everyone contributes. So we do believe in company-wide accessibility and transparency, even to the extent that much of our progress and projects that we're working on are also externally visible at all times as well. So transparency is absolutely massive, but even taking that one step further and allowing absolutely anybody to contribute to anything at any time. So like I mentioned earlier, we have group conversations. We have all folders and files are company accessible. Like, we really believe that at any time, anyone can contribute to the success of a project, but then balancing that with ownership of a project. So not everybody is responsible for a project. Only one DRI, or directly responsible individual, actually owns that and makes the decisions of that project or that decision. And that helps maintain that decision velocity and make sure that things don't get bottlenecked into finding consensus between all of these people that have contributed. We operate on the principle that anyone is welcome to contribute. We want that feedback. We want that collaboration. But at the end of the day, only one person is going to be the final decision maker.
I love that. I like the idea too that anybody can contribute, or at least, look into any project, but there's always somebody who's the stakeholder. There's always somebody who's responsible for it being successful. I think that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we need to probably do another one on this, but I think we're over time. So Laurel, I appreciate you stopping by, talking about, how you guys do things at GitLab. Before we sign off, any last words of wisdom for anybody out there listening in that's trying to, stand up a team ops or people operations department in a fully distributed team?
Yeah, I think that the word of wisdom and word of advice is to just remember that what we have been experiencing for the past 2 years of working from home and working from anywhere absolutely is not the norm nor the ideal. So if we are trying to preserve or maintain what we have built under very stressed and tragic circumstances, or we're trying to recreate the office that we had before, but just in a digital environment, neither of those are sustainable, and they will fail eventually, because both of those are based on office-centric workplace models. And we need to be much, much, much more focused on how we're working and these ways of working that we've been discussing today. And that is exactly what will open the door to success and sustainability as any team, whether you're co-located, hybrid, or distributed. The more that you focus on effectively sharing information, the more that you'll thrive.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Laurel. I appreciate your words of wisdom and taking the time to stop by and talk with us. And before we go, Carlos, can you just pop in with the rest of the announcements for the week?
Yeah, of course, Eddie. I was gonna, as you know, I was gonna blur my background, but I thought it would be a good idea to honor today's topic, right?
I was gonna say, this is the best example of workplace flexibility. So why would you try and hide it? Yeah,
exactly.
Transparency.
Yeah.
Look, while I do this while looking at a playground from watching after my granddaughter. Anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you. So okay, yeah, we got 2 more shows. The one tomorrow is going to be on Wednesday. It'll be with Mark. It's going to be with Rudra Mitra, the founder and CEO of Omdina. And finally, on Thursday, we're going to be speaking with Mark Schwager, the president at Monarch. So that's what we have for the remaining of the week. Awesome. So I hope you join us all right here in Tech Backstage at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Join us here as ever. Remember, and be here or be square. And happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays. Thanks, Laurel. Thanks, Carlos.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.